Hello, and welcome to the North Coast Journal Preview, where we take a look at the stories being followed in the upcoming edition of the North Coast Journal. I'm your host, Dave Frank, and I'm joined this week by North Coast Journal's Arts and Features Editor, Jennifer Fumiko Cahill, and North Coast Journal staff writer, Iridian Casares. Welcome, guys.
Hello.
Hi, how you doing?
Been doing better, but things are okay. I think this week we're going to just dive right in, Jennifer, and you're going to share with us your contribution to this week's edition.
Okay, so this week I have an editorial piece which is in response to the shootings in Atlanta. And if you haven't heard about it by some miracle, or if you were distracted by the other mass shooting that happened just really days after in Colorado, to review, on March 16th, a young white man drove to 3 different Asian-owned spas in the Atlanta area and shot a number of people, 8 of whom were killed, 6 of whom were Asian women, either attending or working at the spas. And the response afterward was, in my piece, I discussed the ways in which it was sort of remarkable and shocking and a really painful moment in particular for the Asian American community, the Asian community in America, as we've been seeing a dramatic rise in anti-Asian attacks, confrontations, and hate crimes. This has been, honestly, since the beginning of Donald Trump's term, but in particular since the arrival of COVID-19 to the United States. This has been called, as we all know, the China virus and Kung flu and, other names that are meant to associate the disease with China, as if China planned it, sent it, as if Asian people here are responsible, that Chinese people in particular, but Asian people in general are somehow responsible. A lot of anger and frustration has been taken out on Asian Americans, and it's been really hard. We've spent the last year in particular, a lot of us feeling less safe, looking over our shoulders, worried about, if I wear a mask somewhere where people aren't wearing masks, am I going to get confronted and potentially attacked? Are there eyes on me? Am I basically a target out in public? And watching people get attacked on the street in San Francisco, New York, and elsewhere has been really hard, in particular watching elders hurt. And there are a lot of theories about why this is happening. The thought that Asian people are easy targets, particularly elderly Asian people, that they're easy targets, that that it's part of the COVID-19 denial and anger, and the belief that the reason we're shutting down businesses and whatnot needs a scapegoat, and Asian Americans have certainly been scapegoated in that role. And it's been a particularly hard year for Asian people in America, who are also going through all of the anxiety, financial pain, et cetera, of a pandemic, and then also feeling like they're potentially going to be the victim of a hate crime. So in some ways, this was a new circumstance. We haven't been here before exactly, but in some ways, it's a repeat. This summer, I took part in some panel discussions in conjunction with KEAT regarding their Asian Americans series, documentaries on the history of Asians in America, and also with HAPI, H-A-P-I, the Humboldt Asian Pacific Islanders in Solidarity. We did a series of discussions about anti-Asian violence and the history of anti-Asian violence in America. And some of the same tropes keep coming back to us. For example, the idea that Asian people carry disease was one of the ways that expulsion of the Chinese was justified when the cheap labor that had been sought out by American employers suddenly became undesirable as competition with white workers. So, these tropes, even though the circumstances are new, the tropes of Asians as being, a virus themselves, those are not new. Those are oldies being brought back. Likewise, some of the same awful tropes that have come up in the Atlanta shooting, the hypersexualization and fetishization of Asian women. Immediately following the shooting, the police captain from Cherokee County had a press conference in which he talked about how, well, this doesn't seem to be race related. It seems to be about this man's sex addiction. And please, the idea that it couldn't be racist because it's about sex, I think that made at least every Asian woman's eyebrow hit her hairline, because the overlap between misogyny, sexual objectification, and racism for Asian women is a particular issue. You may have heard the term misogynoir, which is the particular misogyny layered with racism that Black women face. If there's a term for this with Asian women, I'm not sure what it is. Someone let me know. Hit me on my DMs. But essentially, we have a long history sprouting from wartime prostitution in, war-ravaged countries, and human trafficking in contemporary times that leads to an assumption that Asian women are prostitutes, a fetishization of Asian women as sex objects, and it's a particular burden and threat to Asian women. Essentially, what I'm getting to in the editorial, though, is that none of this is new, and this all feels heartbreakingly familiar, and we keep doing it every so often, right? We often talk about the expulsion of Chinese workers from Eureka in 1885. And even that expulsion had some of the same tropes of Chinese as criminals, as filthy, as, carrying disease. Those same attitudes were at play in 1885. And they were at play when, Vincent Chin was murdered in 1982, and the judge said of the two white men who beat him to death with a baseball bat, well, these are not the kind of men you put in prison. All of those injustices are made easier by dehumanizing us, and dehumanizing Asian people makes it possible for a captain of police in Atlanta to say that, well, this white man was having a very bad day, and so this is what he did. Instead of maybe empathizing with the victims, with their families, it is easy to view us as things rather than people, as kind of, stereotyped robots that you don't have to worry about harming or treating well. And I think that is part of the sort of perpetual motion machine of anti-Asian racism. We have stereotypes that dehumanize us, and those dehumanizing factors make it easier for people to, in mainstream venues and in casual conversation, non-Asian people, honestly, there's an acceptable level of anti-Asian rhetoric and racism that I see all the time. And it contributes to the ease with which people can treat us like nothing. Some of those tropes, like the idea that we're automatically a wealthy community and that we don't need, services, or that we are somehow draining the system by taking all the wealth. In fact, Asians in America have a 12% poverty rate, which is higher than the non-Hispanic white rate of 9.8% poverty. There are a number of, so-called positive stereotypes that, might not be driven by anger, but they do foster a dehumanizing effect. And, I don't see a post, for example, on Facebook locally about an Asian restaurant without seeing somebody showing up to make a comment about whether they're serving cats, is it clean, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sorry if this is the first time, I'm sorry if Asian food is the first time you had a seasoned chicken breast. I'm sorry. But, those tropes come from a very, very upsetting and alienating set of beliefs about how we eat and what we eat, which certainly COVID-19 has brought back into the fore. Seeing people respond to the shootings by making jokes about Asian prostitutes, seeing headlines that hint at the spas, automatically assuming that they are prostitution, centers of prostitution without any fact checking, assuming that all the women involved were prostitutes, is really upsetting. And I don't see the same treatment that I would have seen if all the victims were white. Two of them were. But it's been hard looking at posts and reactions and also just generally how Asian people are discussed in our local community too. And I guess what I'm trying to get across in this editorial is that the small acts of dehumanization that we let go, and in particular non-Asian people, the things that you're letting go and letting slide because, well, that person is older, it's how that generation talks, or it's just a joke, or everybody knows I'm kidding. Those little moments, those little allowed moments of acceptable racism build and build and build to the point where, Asian people are dehumanized. And once dehumanized, why would we be given justice? Why would we be treated fairly? Why wouldn't we be killed by strangers? So it's been a really hard week, I think, for Asian people in America. And I just wanted to maybe touch on that and let everybody kind of feel it with me, and let everybody think about whether or not they are contributing to the situation in which we find ourselves.
Well, thank you so much for writing the editorial, and even more so for sharing your insights and observations and feeling with us today. It's powerful. You did literally touch on any possible question I would have, and then the article stands on its own. The editorial, I recommend people check it out. And the last thing that you said in there is you'd love to be surprised. This was not surprising. Surprising is when this doesn't happen. It requires us to actively call out racism, white supremacy, bigotry when we see it, acknowledge possible prejudices that we carry with us from our socialization process, and be that change. So thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to pivot now to Iridion. Iridion, what did you work on for this week's North Coast Journal? Can you share with us today?
Well, I didn't really work on anything this week, but I would like to share what we did this week. Yeah. So this week's cover story is the Follies, which is usually comes out during Sunshine Week, which is just kind of a week where we educate the public on, government transparency and the importance of those transparencies and the dangers of excessive and unnecessary secrecy. And so the Follies are a collection of kind of the most outrageous stories of public records requests. It's a compilation of all of these. They're from throughout the country, and it's just, journalists, activists, and academics who have filed these public records requests, and either in the process of or when they get those records have experienced some type of retaliation over redactions, a lot of fees, and just transparency malpractice. And so so that's what this week's cover story is. There's a story of like a fluff piece of a dog who was in like a military operation, and there was some confusion about whether the dog was male or female. And so when the reporter got the like veterinary paperwork, everything was redacted from the breed, the age, except for the name and the sex of the dog, which turned out was male. And so it's just kind of those types of stories that we have in this week's cover. And then our other story that we focus on is, of course, of the Sacramento Bee story about our very own Eureka police officers who were involved in a text message thread that included a lot of demeaning content, I guess, and just kind of community response to that story. And so Sergeant Rodrigo Reyna Sanchez, who's been with EPD for 22 years, and Mark Mefta, who's been with the department since 2016, I think about 5 years. We talk about how there was a protest at the Humboldt County Courthouse, calling for the officers to be fired, Eureka City Mayor's Susan Sema's response to these text messages, condemning them, and of course, and so we tried to do a little bit more investigating, and so we talked to the Eureka Police Officer Association, President Terry, and we asked him about the statement that they made, also condemning the text messages, and we asked him whether it was approved, whether the statement was approved by a vote, and who wrote it, but he declined to answer, citing internal association business. And we also reached out to Sherry Malberg, the CEO and clinical director of Restoration Counseling Center, which specializes in the treatment of first responders and their loved ones, about, just kind of coping mechanisms when on the job. And so we asked about the text messages and what are the potential dangers of using this kind of dehumanizing language and humor as a coping mechanism, and the importance of modeling appropriate behavior in an authoritarian position. Yeah, but she didn't answer any of those questions, of course, and she kind of was more focused on the need for officers to have a safe space to kind of just, let go of all these frustrations and things. And so, and we also wrote about the history of the officers, awards they've won and incidents that they were involved with. And so, it was a huge shock, I think, to the entire community when we read that story, for sure.
Well, fantastic. Thank you. Let's take a look a little bit at the abhorrent reported text message scandal. I think that's the article title. For folks who hadn't really heard, that the Sacramento Bee did kind of do this investigative piece that was released, I think actually like a week ago originally. I think we might have mentioned it.
I think it was on Wednesday.
Yeah.
Which I think they were leaked, right? Those text messages were leaked to the Sacramento Bee, which, and then they worked from there. Which, I just want to make a plug. Leak local is all I'm saying.
Yeah.
We're right here.
Right here.
Yeah. So I think it was screenshots of text messages. So that leads you to believe it was somebody who had access to one of their phones. But then, since the leak, since the article originally ran, now the announcement was from EPD Chief Steve Watson that those two officers who were the primary, I guess, actors in the conversation, were placed on paid administrative leave. pending an investigation, and then he clarified with you guys that that's the required response until there was an investigative finding. So that's basically the standard response. They hired a third party to investigate, I think it said in the article, but also there are 4 other officers who I guess were unnamed who were part of that investigation. And so that was just for context. I just wanted to ask you a little bit. I know you answered pretty clearly on this, but I think it's worth repeating that the Restoration Counseling Center basically kind of was saying that the officers have. I took a quote here. It's unrealistic to expect officers to carry the community's trauma but not break. And that they do need a place to have a safe space to process this trauma, basically. So in a way, I just, again, sort of to clarify back and give you a chance, if either of you want to make a comment about this, that we do hold them to a higher standard for a good reason. It's because of that, authority position that they have in our community. And that, the question of what should we have, what's the importance of modeling an appropriate professionalism and healthy coping mechanism, for some reason was not part of the response. I don't know if either of you guys want to comment on like the fact that there is a counseling center who's saying this is, what I just said, basically, that we need to understand where they're coming from in this process at this moment. And I don't know if either of you guys have any feedback on that at all.
I think it's very hard to look at those messages and feel that as a woman, my complaints and concerns, my safety is going to be taken seriously. And as far as, feeling like you have a safe space and that you don't want to be burdened, I wonder how the female officer that they refer to feels about her safety and whether or not her fellow officers have her back, whether or not she can express herself openly and safely. I feel like maybe that safe space is reserved for some people and not for others.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I just want to say again, for those folks who don't know yet, the complaint is that these text messages were misogynistic, dehumanizing, vulgar, and violent, and that they were referring to community members and actions that potentially could be taken by police officers in that context of their interaction with folks. So that's why this is such an elevated consideration now that requires investigation.
Mm-hmm.
You guys, we could go forever. There's so much in there. One last plug for the Follies. I think that is a really hysterical report from. Not that it's hysterical, but it's funny that this is our reality, I suppose.
Yeah, we have to laugh.
Yeah, the Economic Frontier Foundation and Muckrake News together. They produce this each year, and please, I implore folks to check it out, because things that happen in the name of secrecy are hypocritical at best and tragic at worst. So definitely, you guys, this is awesome. We had a great conversation today. Really appreciate you guys. That's about going to do it for us for this week. North Coast Journal is available online and available on newsstands everywhere around the community here. Pick it up, check it out, stay informed. Ridian and Jennifer, thank you so much. We'll see you guys again soon.
Thank you.
See you later.